Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Unfortunately, we're on a bank holiday Monday. Thank you for clicking on your Zoom link today, Ash.
You know what? We cannot be parted, and I won't even let the prospect of getting lit on a Sunday keep me away from you, Michael.
I'm glad to hear it. We don't do Labour Day at Novara Media. What do you think we are, communists? Coming up tonight, Israeli cabinet approves plans to capture all of Gaza. We've got an interview with John Curtice about the local election results, whether or not Nigel Farage can be Prime Minister. And we'll be joined later by Zack, who's just launched his bid to become the leader of the Green Party. We keep saying this, but if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. It really makes a difference. This show, this whole organisation is funded by small donors from our regular viewers. So if you are a regular viewer, if you like what we do, please do consider signing up for whatever you can afford at novaramedia.com/support. The Israeli government has today unanimously approved a plan to capture the whole of Gaza and to occupy it indefinitely. A government official gave Haaretz some of the details, with the newspaper reporting this. According to an Israeli official, the plan includes relocating the population of the Gaza Strip to the south of the enclave. The official said that Netanyahu has made clear that this plan differs from previous ones in that it moves from raid-based operations to the occupation of territory and a sustained Israeli presence in Gaza. Netanyahu said in the discussion that this is a good plan since it can achieve the goals of defeating Hamas and returning the hostages, the official said, and added that Netanyahu is still pushing for the transfer plan and that negotiations on the plan are currently underway with several countries. The transfer plan, of course, being the plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza by kicking out the Palestinians, presumably so Israelis can move in. What appears new in this plan is the admission that Israel's military occupation of large parts of Gaza will be indefinite, and concretely, they've called up tens of thousands of reservists to man the expansion of their operations in Gaza. In practice, though, it's unclear how much this will differ from Israel's tactics over the past 18 months, and it's unclear why this will supposedly defeat Hamas when 18 months of war so far hasn't. For 18 months, Israel has been occupying vast swathes of Gaza with its full military might, with devastating consequences for the people of Gaza. It has also already forced the population of northern Gaza into the south, where it continued to bomb supposed safe zones, all while destroying schools and universities where people were taking shelter. Now, the result has been that the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza has climbed through the tens of thousands, with children and women disproportionately impacted. And the term wounded child, no surviving family has been coined by aid agencies to describe a new and recurring phenomenon taking place in the Strip as thousands of children were left with no one to care for them. But none of that death and destruction defeated Hamas. In fact, when former US Secretary of State Antony Blinken left office late last year, he said the US intelligence assessment was that Hamas had recruited as many militants as it had destroyed. Nor did Israel's last full invasion of the Strip secure the release of Israeli hostages, with former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying in February that a less violent approach would have brought more hostages home and sooner. And the families of the 24 hostages who are still thought to be alive in Gaza agree. In response to Netanyahu's new plan, they said this: the plan approved by the cabinet deserves to be called the Smotrich Netanyahu plan, a plan to abandon the hostages and forsake national and security resilience. This morning, the government admits that it is choosing territory over hostages, contrary to the will of over 70% of the public. Now, this all suggests Israel's new plan isn't a new plan at all. It's simply the old plan, now made slightly more explicit, the reoccupation and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And as Gazans have nowhere to go, ethnic cleansing means genocide, a policy which is never clearer than when it comes to Israel's policies regarding food and medical supplies. Of course, Israel has completely cut off the supply of humanitarian aid to Gaza since it abandoned the ceasefire in March, worsening hunger and malnutrition in the territory. And as part of the country's new plan to occupy the whole of Gaza, the Israeli government has also approved a new humiliating way of distributing aid, one that cuts out the UN and other experienced international humanitarian agencies. This plan would see US private security contractors move aid into what Israel calls the humanitarian zone in southern Gaza. From there, only Palestinians pre-vetted by Israel would be allowed to collect parcels before carrying them back to their families. Now, that's a plan that's been condemned by UN Chief Antonio Guterres, as well as almost every international aid group, who've called it unworkable and inefficient. The Israeli government's plan to invade and occupy Gaza was announced just a day after the country's famous Iron Dome missile system was dramatically breached. This is the moment a Houthi ballistic missile hit near Ben Gurion Airport, just outside the capital, Tel Aviv, on Sunday. So you can see it hitting the airport there. Fired from Yemen, it injured 8 people and forced flights in and out of the airport to be suspended. In response to Israel's Gaza invasion announcement today, the Houthis have said they are working on, quote, a comprehensive air blockade on the Israeli enemy by repeatedly targeting airports. Ash, this announcement today that the Israeli cabinet has unanimously agreed to sort of permanently or indefinitely occupy Gaza, it's been sort of high up in the news. Have we actually learned anything new here?
Well, yes and no. I think that it is meaningful when the Israeli government is able to make explicit something that has been on the agenda for a very long time. And also, it's meaningful when that admission hits the English speaking media. It's not new information if you've been paying attention to what the Israeli government has been doing in Gaza since October 2023, or indeed the long arc of Israeli politics since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1947, 1948. So what I don't know what to say about this other than I think to point to some of the inadequacies of English-speaking media, because I think that one of the best judges of media is what kind of context does it introduce. Now, when back in 2023, you had the expulsion orders given to the north of Gaza and Gaza City, you had the entirety of the British media singing from the same song sheet, which is, this is a military measure. It's temporary. Oh, well, you've got the Norwegian Refugee Council suggesting that it might be forcible transfer, but who can say at this point? And anyone who tried to link that expulsion order to a long history of Palestinians being told to leave their homes, leave the places where they live, and never being allowed to return, they were basically treated as though they were Hamas sympathizers. This was not considered relevant information. And in fact, it was, considered nothing less than, expressing a covert affinity with Hamas. This has been exactly what Likud has wanted for a long time. They've been very open about the idea that there isn't a two-state solution. What the two-state solution is cope for Western governments such as our own, who can point to things like Oslo and, we have to get a peace process back on track, when even the purpose of Oslo was not to have a viable Palestinian state. It could not be a state that would be acceptable to the majority of Palestinians because of the amount of Israeli control. When you look at the images of Israel presented by Likud and other Israeli parties, they don't depict 1967 borders. They depict a state of Israel existing between the river and the sea in its entirety. So this genocide in Gaza, I think it has to be viewed as an opportunistic response to October 7th. It's certainly not a proportionate response, and it's certainly not one which... The idea that the destruction of Hamas is a military objective, that is also a pretext, because as you pointed out, Hamas has been able to recruit more militants, according to Antony Blinken. Why? Because the Israeli occupation has been waging a genocide. There's no better recruiter for militants than systematic state oppression that radicalizes people. And I think that many of us can imagine ourselves in the position of somebody who's lost everything, lost their family, lost their home, been starved, been bombarded, lost their access to education, thinking, well, what is there for me to do apart from take up arms? I think that that's not beyond the stretch of imagination. So this has been an obvious place, I think, that the Israeli government would go. I think Donald Trump in the White House certainly makes a difference to what they feel they can be open about. I mean, it makes you realize just how responsible the Biden administration was. That was a moment where the suspension of arms could have been on the table, the ending of military aid, forcing Israel to a quick ceasefire. And Biden didn't want to do that because he was scared of pissing off AIPAC, just like everybody else. What you're going to see from Labour is the same old bleating, oh, we need a two-state solution, oh, we need to get a peace process back on track. And what I want to see from British media, and I won't hold my breath, is what fucking two-state solution? What two-state solution? You cannot have a state which is non-contiguous. You cannot have a state where Palestinian people have been forced into smaller and smaller Bantustans, effectively. And you cannot have a state where Israel continually seems to reserve the right to redraw its borders whenever it wants to. There is no two-state solution. There is a one-state reality based on genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. What the opposite of that is would be a democratic one-state reality. I don't hold my breath for that either. But every time you hear a Labour politician, or not just a Labour politician, any Labour politician talk about a two-state solution, they're either idiots or actively disingenuous, because no serious person thinks that any Israeli government, we're not just talking about Netanyahu, we're not just talking about Smotrich, we're not just talking about Likud, there is no Israeli government that is going to deliver a two-state solution. It's complete nonsense.
So Netanyahu this afternoon said the population of northern Gaza will be moved for its own protection. And he said that Israeli soldiers won't go into Gaza and then launch raids and then retreat. He says the intention is the opposite of that. So the intention is to stay. Thursday's election results caused a political earthquake in England, with Nigel Farage's Reform taking control of 10 county councils, 2 mayoralties and 1 extra MP. And the press is now full of speculation that Nigel Farage could be the next Prime Minister. In The Telegraph, Alison Pearson claimed that a new dawn had broken and that Farage might just be our next Prime Minister. For the BBC, Laura Koonsberg said the election proved Farage's ambitions to lead the country were not a wild notion. And even Kemi Badenoch has admitted that her rival in Reform could get the job she so covets. So are they right? Well, earlier today, I caught up with elections guru, Professor John Curtice.
There's another 4 years to go between now and the next general election. And one should be very, very wary about trying to anticipate the outcome of a general election on the back of local elections just 1 year in to a current parliament. I mean, anybody who has any memory of what happened in the last parliament should be extremely wary about assuming that things are going to stay constant. After all, in the last parliament, the Conservatives were dominant in the polls and in local elections in the first 2 years of that parliament, and then along came Partygate, and the rest is history. More broadly, I mean, I would say clearly, there is a possibility that Reform could well be significant players in the next election. Essentially, the foundation of their position and what they achieved on Thursday is essentially to take away from the Conservatives what we might call the pro-Brexit Johnsonian coalition. The Reform success is very heavily concentrated amongst people who voted for Brexit, who would still vote for Brexit in areas where Brexit was relatively popular back in 2016. Now, that's not just an indication of people's attitudes towards the European Union. It's part of a broader mindset, because people who are in favour of Brexit tend to be more concerned about immigration. They tend to be less liberal on issues of transgender. They are the people who think that we are denigrating our past and our imperial past and our empire, et cetera, far too much. It's a very, very clear, distinct outlook. It was the section of our society that swung in behind Boris Johnson in 2019. Reform took a lot of it away back in last summer, and they've now pretty much, I think, taken pretty much all of it. It's not, in these local elections at least, the Conservatives are no more successful in the strongest pro-Leave areas as they are in the most pro-Remain areas. But beyond that, I mean, the issue is twofold. One is the question of parliamentary arithmetic. In other words, is it clear that the moment that Reform can get to 326? Well, not necessarily. Bear in mind, they only just got about 30% of the vote in these elections. The second is, would they be in a position to do a deal with anybody, to get them in a position where they might be able to take them over the line? All of that is deeply, deeply uncertain.
And so obviously, I mean, something going on at these elections was Reform trying to overtake the Tories as the sort of main right-wing party, and I suppose what usually is a two-party system. Labour also had a bad night. To what extent are those two connected? Were Labour losing votes to Reform, or was this basically Labour losing votes to people to their left?
Well, the evidence both of the polling and of the local elections is that the Reform are primarily taking votes off the Conservatives. And of course, the baseline for Thursday's elections was May 2021. And we know that between then and last year's general election, Reform took almost wholly voters off the Conservatives. But you can still see where Reform do best. It's the Conservatives who particularly suffer. It is not Labour who particularly suffer. Okay. That said, Reform ended up, in terms of share of the vote, doing as well in Labour-held wards as they did in Conservative-held wards, because there are sufficient people who voted Conservative in 2021 in those wards to take Reform a long way there. Plus, the other thing we do know from opinion polls is that Labour is now indeed losing some support to Reform. But actually, would that Labour's problems were that simple? The opinion polls suggest, and again, you can look at the local elections and find other evidence of this, is that Labour's problem is that their vote's going all over the place. So basically, if you take the opinion polls from just before the local elections, of those people who voted Labour in 2024, 9% have gone to Reform. That's a much bigger figure than last summer, but it is only 9%. 9% are going to the Liberal Democrats. 8% were going to the Greens, and even the Conservatives were making net gains from Labour. So Labour's problem is that its coalition is fracturing in different directions. We certainly know that amongst younger people, the Greens inflicted quite considerable damage amongst Labour last summer, and certainly where the Greens do particularly well in these local elections, and of course there's not a great deal of variation in their performance, but where they did do relatively well, it is indeed Labour and the Liberal Democrats who primarily suffer, and not the Conservatives. So broadly speaking, we do now have a two-block system in Britain. So we don't have a two-party system anymore, but we have a two-block system. There's a lot of interchange between the Conservatives and Reform. There's a lot of interchange between Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. But the party that is most in the middle of these two blocks, the centre party of British politics, is Labour, and therefore Labour are at risk of losing votes in both directions.
You can also phrase that in a positive way, which is that Labour are the only ones who can unite the two sides if they have a particular policy platform which can do it. And I suppose that gets on to how Labour should respond. Obviously, big debates within the Labour Party, which involve people's sort of political persuasions and their sort of ethical commitments. But from you as a pollster, what do you make of the various positions being put forward? So obviously, there are some people close to Keir Starmer who seem to want him to go further to the right on migration to try and meet Reform in the middle and peel some of their voters off. Other people on the left who are saying now is the time to properly do economic populism because you're never going to beat Reform at their own game. From the perspective of someone sort of looking at the numbers and the polling, which of those do you think has more, I suppose, credibility?
The answer already follows from what I said is neither. Let me tell you one other crucial feature of the local election results. Where did Labour's vote fall most? By a very substantial amount. Answer, the wards that Labour were trying to defend. In fact, the electoral system worked against Labour in exactly the same way as it worked against the Conservatives. But that isn't just an electoral system point. Partly it's arithmetically inevitable, but it also suggests that where are Labour losing ground most? In its heartlands. And in fact, some of the recent multiple regression and post-stratification polling also suggests that Labour's fall in support since last summer is in the areas where it's strongest. And I would say to you, the fact that Labour are even having the debate about what to do in these terms just reveals a fundamental weakness of Labour's appeal really over the last few years. It's constantly thinking about how it should position itself in order to defeat its opponents. It is not thinking about how to best position itself in order to define itself for the electorate and to be clear about what it's about. And I would argue that the fundamental problem that Labour have is they went into government without a clear narrative or story about what they're about. Voters and did not embrace. I mean, Labour only got 35% of the vote. I mean, ignore that parliamentary majority. It is very, very misleading. Labour came out of the 2024 election skating on very thin ice, and the ice has just simply melted, perhaps even more quickly than some of us anticipated. But then what's happened is that because people don't have a vision of what this government's about, and then they hear that winter fuel allowance is going down and benefits and welfare is being cut, they kind of go, well, we thought that the one thing we did know about the Labour Party is that it wanted to look after people who are relatively badly off. And apparently this government is not even in favour of that. That's why those issues end up having resonance. The fundamental, so my answer to is not to try to tack left or to tack right, but to march ahead to the drumbeat of a sound that you yourself create. Because unless Labour define what this government is about, it is always at risk of other people defining it for themselves and their opponents defining it for themselves. And therefore, Labour will always be vulnerable.
And the deputy leader of the Greens has today launched a challenge to the co-leaders of the Green Party. So Zack Polanski is standing against Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the sort of internal workings of the Green Party, but his argument, Zack's argument, is that the Greens have somewhat underperformed recently, because if you look at what's going on the right, you've got this sort of right-wing populism of Nigel Farage, which has been incredibly successful and has managed to tap into the anger of the general public and challenge the Conservatives as one of the two main parties. Whereas the Greens, I mean, they're doing better than they have, but it's sort of 1 or 2 points better as opposed to a breakout moment. When you look at the Greens, do you think that as it stands, they have been underperforming?
I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it. I mean, I think one has to say, first of all, that 9% in the opinion polls is an equal record, which is their current average, is an equal record high. And it matches what they got in the immediate wake of the 1989 European elections, when they did dramatically well and came third, and that stage caused quite an earthquake. It helped to lead to some of Margaret Thatcher's statements about needing to deal with the Green agenda thereafter. And there was a very brief period when even in polling for Westminster, they were at 9%. That's where they're at now. That said, well, I was saying on Friday, yeah, I think it's fair to say that as compared with recent local election performance, because the Greens have made incremental progress in local elections in recent years. They do now tend to do better in local elections than in national elections. And they've also succeeded in start to be able to turn local elections into parliamentary success with some of their successes last year. But it's certainly fair to say that they are not having the same and while they're certainly having some success at eroding Labour and profiting from Labour's unpopularity, they're not having the same degree of success reform or having the Conservatives. Now, of course, part of the problem is that there's also the competition for Liberal Democrats, right? But particularly insofar as what at the end defines reform is their socially conservative agenda. What certainly defines the Greens at least as much as anything else is their socially liberal agenda, but the Liberal Democrats also occupy that space as well. So to that extent, at least, there is more competition for, as it were, the progressive voter than there is elsewhere. So I think it's a fair comment, but A, don't underestimate what has been achieved. But be sure, is there more opportunity out there? Perhaps.
And in terms of how they do that, is there space for a sort of economic populism of the left that you think could do well with this electorate? Obviously, the Labour Party, seem quite centrist when it comes to the economy. The Lib Dems, obviously very centrist when it comes to the economy. Could the Greens carve out a more economically populist space and maybe make waves, sort of really create some momentum behind them? Do you think that's plausible?
Certainly the challenge to all of our political parties is to be able to articulate and channel the deep economic pessimism in our society and the deep concern about the state of our public services. Nigel Farage does that brilliantly, and therefore, as a result, is able to win over the support of the corner of the market we have been talking about. That said, it does have to be borne in mind, and this in the end is a real constraint. We basically maxed out our credit card during the pandemic and in the wake of the Russian-Ukraine war. So there is relatively little room for maneuver so far as increasing public spending is concerned, certainly increasing public spending without also increasing taxation. And we do have to be mindful for all the rhetoric that there is about the Conservatives having presided over austerity. Actually, the last Conservative government presided over the biggest increase in public spending since 1945. So there are significant constraints on the left. My view is that the Labour Party made a mistake, certainly so far as positioning themselves for government is concerned, in accepting all the Conservative tax cuts before the election. But whether or not the electorate will be willing to pay a great deal more, given that taxation is already relatively high, that's another matter. Because the room for increasing borrowing is probably quite limited, because the last thing you can afford is to precipitate a financial crash.
The Greens didn't do badly in last week's local elections. They increased their number of councillors by 44, which added to their record 4 MPs in Parliament, meaning this iteration of the party is more successful than any that went before. But for their deputy leader, that wasn't enough. And Zack Polanski has today launched a leadership bid to take control of the party.
We all know we need a party that is bolder, clearer about what it is that we stand for, and crucially, what we will always stand against. A party that can cut through, not just to those who already agree, but to millions more people. A party that knows inequality is at the heart of all of our problems. Town, village, country, city, wherever you live, inequality hurts us all. A party that will confront fascism and will call a genocide exactly what it is. Now is the moment to build the next generation. New faces, new names, new voices. This is how we'll win. We can beat reform, win more councillors, and send more Green MPs to Parliament.
That was part of Zack Polanski's pitch to be party leader. Very catchy music in the background. And I'm now joined by Zack. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, before I get into your sort of policy and the like, what's going on here? Is this a hostile takeover bid? Because I assume Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey have been somewhat taken by surprise.
There's nothing hostile about it whatsoever, so I'm pleased you're asking me that question. The Green Party have mandatory leadership contests every 2 years. The difference is we've not had one for 4 years because of the general election caused a disruption to that cycle. So all I'm doing is announcing that in this summer's leadership contest, I intend to stand because I think the membership deserve a choice. I think John Curtice was fair enough there. We have had solid results. In fact, we're the only party that have gained councillors in the last 8 elections. I've been out and I've defended that result, and I've not defended it because I'm a party machine. I've defended it because it's a good record. The problem is good records will not stop the rise of reform. Good records will not challenge this Labour government. And ultimately, if we really are going to harness the potential of the Green Party, we need a mass movement. We need more members. We need people organising in their communities. And we need bold, clear messaging. And that's what I'm bringing to the table.
I suppose I want to talk about the challenging reform part, because I can clearly see a way that a more dynamic Green Party, no disrespect to the current leaders, but sort of a party which is more on the front foot could peel away more Labour voters, right? If it is sort of just very consistently economically populist. And there are lots of Labour voters who are upset about their positions on migrations and trans rights, for example, and they could easily sort of be attracted to the Greens. Winning over reform voters seems like a harder challenge for a party like yours. Are you serious about that, or is that just sort of something you're saying?
No, I know it's absolutely doable. In fact, I was with a Guardian journalist just last week who came door knocking with me for 5 hours. We didn't find a single Labour or Tory voter. But what we did find is lots of people who are saying, I'm either going to vote for the Reform Party or I'm going to vote for the Green Party. Now, that's very counterintuitive to people. But when you dig down, there was a very small group of people who I would say were explicitly racist. I wasn't going to win their vote, and nor would I want to win their vote. But actually, the vast majority of those people, when you dug down into those conversations, it often became about immigration. But actually, it wasn't about immigration at all. It was about lack of housing. It was about lack of access into the NHS. It was about worries about the future of their country. And when you have a 3-minute or 4-minute conversation about the wealth of multimillionaires or billionaires that is getting bigger and bigger as they're having to pay more rent, they can't afford food, they're struggling with public transport, all of those things, you can understand how people have got angry. And I think ultimately it's about really hearing people's anger, meeting them where it is, but not offering the division of despair, or sorry, the politics of division of despair as the Reform Party do, but actually going, we can genuinely help you here with tangible solutions, which aren't just kind of political chatter, but actually things that will materially change your life. And where I absolutely disagree with John Curtice, he's a brilliant pollster, but I wouldn't take his economics advice, is this idea of maxing out the credit card is the biggest false narrative we need to take on in this country. The household budgets that use credit cards are nothing like a national budget. And we know from the Attlee government that when we spend money to invest, that's the best possible thing for the country. And during COVID, we did this because there was an emergency and everyone agreed there was an emergency. I would argue right now, with a housing crisis, with an NHS crumbling, with a climate crisis, with racist riots on the streets last summer, we are in several emergencies. And it's time to stop worrying about corporate lobbyists and protecting the wealth of the rich and actually start to spend money on our public services.
I suppose on that thing about winning over Reform voters, and obviously I wasn't party to the conversations you had, but there is sort of one idea in politics which I think has sort of a fair amount of validity, which is you can choose your sort of dividing lines and you should be quite disciplined about keeping to them. And one argument goes that the left wins more when you can keep the dividing line to economics and the right prefers it to be on cultural issues. And you can look potentially at sort of Labour in 2017, where the dividing line was, taxes on the rich and more social housing. And then Labour in 2019, where the dividing line was Brexit and which election went better. And I suppose my question to you is, are you willing to, I suppose, downplay some of those cultural issues that might win you over Labour voters if it means having a chance of peeling off some voters from Reform?
No, and this is exactly what the leadership bid is ultimately about. It's being really unambiguous about what we stand for and what we always will stand against. Now, some people will say you need huge, broad coalitions, you need broad churches. Yes, you do need broad churches, but broad churches have to have walls. And I think sometimes people aren't voting for the Green Party in the past because they think that our walls have not been, it's not been clear enough for things that we stand for. And I think there are huge swathes of Labour voters who are so unhappy with this Labour government, but haven't yet realised that the Green Party can win. We know how to win now. There are over 39 constituencies where we came second place to an increasingly unpopular Labour government. And there are many other constituencies, by the way, where we are also doing well. Some of our MPs we won from fourth place to first place. So there's nowhere a Green Party politician can't win if you tell a powerful story. And I believe the powerful story that needs to be told is a story of compassion. It's about care. And yes, it is about an economics that is ultimately saying we are the 99%. We need to challenge the wealthy. We need to challenge the powerful. And we need to work with our working class communities, not because we have some obsession about saying the phrase working class, but actually that's the vast majority of people. And they are being screwed over by politics. John Curtice again said there, the Labour government, need to start marching to the drum of what they actually believe in. Well, I would say what this Labour government believe in is their right-wing Labour lobbyists who have literally come from corporate lobbying jobs and are now doing the exact work of where they came from. So I don't believe this Labour government, even if they sorted out their comms, are going to fix this problem, because ultimately they are there to defend capital. The Green Party have only two vested interests: it's people and the planet, and that's what I'll defend.
Yeah, I suppose my question about would you be willing to downplay potentially cultural divides to sort of make the economic divide front and centre and not get distracted on things which might divide sort of Britain's working class, was because I think, I would suggest that that's probably going to be the best way to try and peel off Reform voters. I feel like when you said you wouldn't downplay the cultural stuff, you reverted back to saying there are lots of unsatisfied Labour voters who the Greens can win by being bold on both fronts. Now, I absolutely think that's the case, but I suppose I want to hammer down on this issue of how you're going to win reform voters and will you make any compromises to do that. And the reason I suppose I think this matters is because if you see at the moment the sort of number one challenge the UK faces as a potential Nigel Farage government, then it matters if your pitch to lead a left-wing party is to say, we are going to further divide or fragment the anti-reform sort of coalition, or we are going to eat into reform's vote base. And I suppose, can I get you to elaborate a bit more on how you're going to do that latter part? Are there any sort of compromises you make that would maybe upset parts of the Green Party membership base that could win over reform voters instead of just peeling off Labour ones?
So it's an important distinction. First of all, I don't think the Green Party are going to win by converting all reform voters to the Green Party. And I know that that's not your question, but I just want to be really clear about that. I think there is a chunk of those voters, though, who like Nigel Farage because they know he speaks for truth. They think he speaks to the things that they care about, and also that he is honest. Now, we could have a whole conversation about Nigel Farage, but that's the appearance that they're getting. And I think what they sometimes get, or they certainly get with the Labour Party, is the sense that people are talking out both sides of their mouth and not really telling the truth. And so I think that's the first thing, is to just be really clear in our communication. The second thing, I think, is the job here is to make the Labour Party more scared of losing seats and ultimately, votes, and more ultimately seats to the Green Party than to Reform. Right now, we have a party that is totally under hostage to the Reform Party. And it's a completely nonsense strategy for the Labour Party, because if people want full fat Nigel Farage, they'll vote Reform. So I don't know what the Labour Party are doing there. I believe, and I think it's clear, that as the Green Party continue to be an electoral threat to the Labour Party, before we're even winning seats, we can be pulling that Labour Party to the left. How well that will work, I think is a fair question, because I think it's a Labour Party that is absolutely determined not to be pulled to the left. But even on the day of these local elections, they announced they were going to put a solar panel on every single new build, something the Green Party have been arguing for literally, I think, a decade. And it's interesting they did it on the day of the election because they were worried that they were going to lose votes to the Green Party. I think more widely than that, though, and I think this comes to really what your question is. So when it comes to immigration, which I guess is the obvious thing that splits the Reform Party and the Green Party, or one of the obvious things, we can't be compromising about this. Immigration is a good thing for this country. What I think has happened is that politicians speak out both sides of their mouth, or they're not being quite clear about things. And so Reform, just kind of someone who might be thinking about voting Reform goes, I'm being told lies again. Whereas if someone is really honest to tell the story in this country, that someone who is an immigrant is more likely to be paying more in tax than they are in benefits. When you use the National Health Service, the person who treats you is so much more likely to be anyone in front of you in the queue. And actually, with a lowering birth population, we are going to need immigrants in this country. I think that's a conversation we need to have. Now, will the average Reform voter love and embrace that conversation straight away? No, absolutely not. But that's why we've got to get better at telling powerful stories that aren't just about presenting facts on their own, which might be right and they might be earnest, but they're not going to convince anyone. But through the power of story, the power of video, social media, we need to be ultimately talking to these communities, because actually throughout history, particularly white working class communities, have often shown huge solidarity to people of colour, global majority communities, and other working class communities. I think we need to create that sense of community again. But actually what this Labour government have done, and the Tory government before them, and the Labour government before that, is destroyed absolutely any sense of community, both in terms of physical space where people can gather, but also a general sense that there's a community. Without that, of course, there's going to be division. Ultimately, we need to be there on the grassroots, rebuilding community so people can trust their neighbours once again.
And you mentioned they're sort of pulling the Labour Party in a certain direction. And I suppose here maybe we could go back to sort of previous iterations of the Greens, because I suppose from my analysis, I think that Labour being pulled to the left on the economy would definitely be electorally advantageous to them. I think the only reason they're not doing that is because they're scared of corporate interests who they're friends with, basically. I 100% think that should happen. Now, when it comes to migration or gender identity, I can see the big moral case for doing it. I think the electoral case is less clear. And I think the Greens have not always played a brilliant role when it came to this. So as I said earlier, sort of 2017, you have a Labour Party who tries to keep to the economic. They say the big dividing lines between the many and the few. And then they moved to a different position in 2019, which is for a second referendum, which sort of completely divides their electorate. And one of the movements which was pulling them away from the economic towards the cultural was the Green Party. And I suppose I want to bring up a tweet that's been circulating of yours. You'll have seen this already because it's been circulating on Twitter today, which Zack Polanski, I'm a pro-European Jew. It's increasingly clear that two reasons that's two reasons I couldn't vote for Labour under Jeremy Corbyn from March 25th, 2018. So park the Judaism, anti-Semitism thing for one moment, because I think that's why people were sharing that. But from the European perspective, one of my interpretations of what happened between 2017 and 2019 is that there was a radicalization in favour of Remain amongst people who voted Remain, and that really screwed over the Labour Party, right? It would have been much better if everyone just sort of calmed down and said, let's do a soft Brexit and keep talking about economics. And I feel like the Greens played a proactive role in, to some degree, sort of subverting a successful strategy. And I worry if you agree with me, first of all, and if you've learned from that perhaps in terms of what role you could have in defeating reform as part of a broader left.
Yeah, so I know you said you wanted to deal with the European thing, just to deal with the anti-Semitism thing very quickly, because I think that needs addressing. Jeremy Corbyn at the time was talking about pockets of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Having had the experience now of being in the leadership position and experiencing the attacks from often the Jewish Chronicle, other so-called mainstream Jewish organisations, despite being Jewish myself, I now have a new appreciation for what Jeremy Corbyn was dealing with at that time. Do I think he dealt with it perfectly? No, I don't think Jeremy thinks he dealt with it either. But also, I absolutely reflect it was not helpful for me to assume that the Labour Party was rife with anti-Semitism when we now know that blatantly was not true. But what did I have at the time to go as evidence? As a Jewish person, I had the leader themselves saying, I have anti-Semitism in my party. So I appreciate that's a complex and nuanced answer. And, there is an apology to Jeremy Corbyn in that too, in terms of, yes, he didn't handle it perfectly. There are things I didn't handle perfectly, including that. But I think you can reflect on things and go, from here, let's move on. And actually, I would love to see the left unite on this, because actually being pro-Palestinian should never be conflated with being anti-Semitic. In the same breath, we know anti-Semitism exists, and we also need to be strident with tackling that in the same way with Islamophobia. But it does Jewish people like myself no favours when people conflate these things. In fact, they make us less safe in our communities. To the European question, though, I think this is much more complex, because actually we had a establishment government with David Cameron and just before that, Nick Clegg, ultimately saying, vote Remain and everything will stay the same, implying that the status quo was fine, you're happy with how things are going, don't let chaos ensue. And I think huge working class communities went, I don't, I'm not even interested in Brexit necessarily, although they got interested in Brexit, but I want anything but this. And for the first time, my vote is going to count. It's Remain or leave, off I go. Now, I think there was a nuanced point that was tried to be made, and I agree failed, which was, we're not telling you we're wrong. We were saying, let's have another vote on what the terms of that deal are, because it was totally unclear at the time whether it was a soft Brexit, whether it was a hard Brexit. I suppose my reflection is, and I wasn't, on the front line of politics at that time, or certainly not involved with the Green Party in the way I am now. But before the referendum even happened, the argument should have been that the first referendum should have agreed what the terms were, so people were making a choice rather than this ridiculous binary choice without a threshold. This all sounds like I'm avoiding the question. I'm absolutely not. But my point is really that this was such a complex, messy situation before Jeremy Corbyn even came along, before the so-called People's Vote campaign came along. I don't think there was any way of getting through this at this point without people feeling like, I've told you very clearly what I want, and now you're telling me what I don't want. On top of that, Jeremy's USP, I think, was that he spoke clearly and told the truth. And we can get into a whole conversation about what Jeremy thinks about Brexit or not Brexit. But I think it's fair to say, he was at least soft Eurosceptic, and he was pushed largely by Keir Starmer, ironically enough, into taking a pro-Remain position. And Keir Starmer won't now touch the European Union, which is another example of how duplicitous Starmer is. I think the takeaway to take from all of this is, one, to be really clear about what you stand for and what you stand against. But the much more important point is the community organising point. That's something Jeremy Corbyn started with, a community organising unit, but actually Starmer on his very first week abolished the unit. But I think unless you go into those communities, unless you have those conversations door to door, and unless you actually co-design the argument with people, those communities who have been most screwed over by establishment politicians and decades of austerity will be the people who feel and know they are being talked down to, unless they are actually actively engaged in the conversation, and I would argue leading the conversation. And I think that's a point that anyone on the left, no matter where you are, needs to take. And I hope people watching this interview or getting excited about my campaign will join the Green Party, because that's the exact conversation we need to be having.
And
of course,
sorry,
the conversation too.
My next question might sound a bit personal, but please take it in the right way because it also applies to me. When I think about sort of who could take on Nigel Farage in this country, who could be sort of the image of left populism, I think of someone like Mick Lynch, someone who is very visibly reads as sort of like a working class fighter who can speak to people who might be attracted to reform. I don't really think of someone who went from the Lib Dems to the Greens, sort of lives in London, reads as quite middle class, sort of from the political industry, let's say. And as I say, this applies to me as well, but I don't think I'm the answer. I don't think I'm the left populist answer the country needs. But do you really think that you are the right person to sort of embody the anger that working class people in Britain feel at the establishment?
I'd start by saying I'm not from political industry, but I take some of your points more widely. But I definitely was not a career politician. In fact, as famously, I've managed to get myself into trouble in the past for various acting jobs and all sorts of things, we can also talk about. But the point is this as well, though. I'm not running to say I am the voice of the left or I am the working class champion. That first of all would be highly egotistical and also just not true and disingenuous. What I am saying, though, is I'm a person who is looking to lead a Democratic Party that already has MPs, that has power bases and councillors, to look at community organising approaches to create, or not even create, future leaders are not found, they are developed. And we need to making sure we're going into communities and finding people who are already leaders. They're just not political leaders. They're the people who are running the food banks, who are doing stuff in faith centres and not faith centres. They're people who are teachers, nurses, doctors, cleaners, all the people who have got ordinary jobs and are maybe going, I'm not interested in politics because I can't see how that's going to make any change to my life. I'm looking to create a story with them where they are at the centre of that story. And actually, if I'm succeeding at my job in future years, we will see more and more people speaking both within the Green Party and frankly, out of the Green Party and the trade union movement too, that I'd love us to align with more with workers' movements, with organising movements, with anti-war movements, whatever it might be. It is about having a whole range of people, a whole cast of people. People are ultimately unique and you can never be anything but yourself, and no one should ever apologise where they've come from. No one should ever apologise for being in a party, even if it was the Lib Dems. I want more people from the Lib Dems to come and join the Green Party. I want more people from Labour to join the Green Party. This is ultimately the point, to win the argument and have people join you. But it's not just about being a political party. It is about winning the argument in communities. It's, again, I've said it a few times, but it's the most important thing. Growing those grassroots, it's investing in future people, it's investing in working class communities. It's not about us or them, it is us. And it's ultimately people finding a home in the Green Party and going, actually, this is the place where I can make change in my community.
Novara Media has a new podcast series out now. It's called Committed. It's about Britain's political prisoners, some of them facing years in prison. Over 4 episodes, Novara reporters Rivka Brown and Claire Heimer speak to 5 young people in jail to find out how Just Stop Oil persuaded so many of them to take direct action against the climate crisis. It's a fascinating listen. And all the episodes of Committed are out now. You can find the full series on your preferred podcast service or visit novaramedia.com/committed. It really is interesting. I recommend you search that out. While Reform have spent the weekend celebrating, the Labour Party have been trying to get their heads around a new political reality. This was Keir Starmer's take on his party's washout at the local elections.
But the message I take out of these elections is that we need to go further and we need to go faster on the change that people want to see, and that's what I'm determined to do.
Now, that message, more of the same but faster, has not gone down well with some Labour backbenchers.
I mean, the idea that the public have given us such a kicking because they think we're not going fast enough and they want more of the same is just nonsense. It's arrant nonsense. I mean, the public are ahead of the government here. The public are calling out for more equality in distribution of wealth.
Protecting people, helping people to move forward in their lives and ensuring we've got those public services ready and working so that people can have that support when they need it. That is what Labour governments do. And I believe that when Labour does not meet that sweet spot, that expectation that people have of a Labour government, then they start to look in less favourable places.
Things like the winter fuel payment cut, things like the proposed cut to disability benefit, those aren't Labour approaches and they need to change. We look at the election in Runcorn, we had a 15,000 majority there. It was swept away, and it's not good enough to say, oh, we only lost by 6 votes. That's a seat we should never lose, whatever the circumstances of the by-election.
In the Times, former Transport Secretary Louise Haigh had this proposal for the Prime Minister. So she said, the government's response on Friday was alarming. It failed to acknowledge any need to change course, but simply committed itself to double down on the plan whilst hemorrhaging votes to the parties of our left and right. It is now urgent that we develop a vision and a strategy that is confident in our values, sets the terms of the debate and takes the fight to reform rather than letting the fight come to us. That is the only way to hold our perilous coalition together. I believe the only way to achieve that is through an economic reset, through ripping up our self-imposed tax rules and by a serious programme of investment and reindustrialisation, because Nigel Farage is not wooing these voters with a traditionally right-wing offer. He is calling for the nationalisation of steel and water. Polling I saw revealed that banning fire and rehire was almost as popular among Reform voters as Labour ones. Laura Kuenssberg asked Health Secretary Wes Streeting about Starmer's message on the BBC.
There are changes you've made that you didn't warn people about, that people don't like. And telling people again and again you're going to go farther and faster with things that they don't want, is that really going to cut it?
Well, it's the outcomes people want to see. They want to see safer streets. They want to see stronger, more secure borders. They want to see waiting lists falling. They want to see the cost of living improving. Those things do take time. And you don't turn around a country with the range, the breadth, the depth of crises we inherited. You don't turn that around in just 9 months. So all I'd say to people, we've got the message. We're not daft. We haven't got our heads in the sand. All I'd ask people for is to give us a bit of time and to give us the benefit of the doubt.
We haven't got our heads in the sand, but give us the benefit. You can't go into government, sort of say, we're going to bring about this big change and then sort of be a bit crap for 6 months and then get hammered in an election and say, oh, go on, give us a break. Give us a break. I think you might need something a bit more concrete than that. There's also been briefing from Downing Street that a couple of ministers might be up for the chop in response to last week's disaster. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson has been tipped for demotion in a post-local election reshuffle, apparently over school reforms that blindsided the Prime Minister. That article also describes Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy as, quote, a certainty for the sack. I don't know what she's done wrong. This idea that sort of I actually find Bridget Phillipson very sort of almost disturbingly robotic. But Lisa Nandy, like politics aside, is anyone's bad impression of Labour because of Lisa Nandy? Who knows? Meanwhile, key advisors are trying to show they're not to blame for the catastrophe. This one really made me laugh. It's from the Financial Times. Chancellor Rachel Reeves cut the winter fuel allowance last July after the election to bolster the public finances, claiming the previous Conservative government had overspent. It was something the Treasury had been trying to get away with for ages, said a former senior government minister. Or senior government figure, sorry. They said Morgan McSweeney, then Starmer's head of political strategy, but now chief of staff, pretty much hung his head in his hands when he learned of the decision because he knew what it meant politically. While the local, to find this out now, right? This was months ago. He's Keir Starmer's key advisor, right? Keir Starmer has obviously signed off this decision, has stood by this decision for months when everyone was saying they should U-turn. Now they've finally lost in these elections. Suddenly Morgan McSweeney's got someone to message the Financial Times, tell them I never liked the policy anyway. Like, you're the most powerful person inside that government. While the local election shock amongst the Labour ranks was still hitting home, other Labour ministers were out on the airwaves this weekend, proving not only that they're not listening, but that they're completely tone deaf. On Friday, Leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, appeared on Radio 4's Any Questions with Conservative activist Tim Montgomery. He's actually a Reform UK activist now. This happened.
I don't know whether you saw the documentary on Channel 4 about rape gangs over this.
We want to blow that little trumpet now, do we? Yeah, okay.
There was a real issue.
Let's get that dog whistle out, shall we?
Okay, Lucy. Yeah.
There was a really big backlash to those comments, and a day later, Powell posted this apology. In the heat of a discussion on Any Questions, I would like to clarify that I regard issues of child exploitation and grooming with the utmost seriousness. I'm sorry if this was unclear. I was challenging the political point scoring around it, not the issue itself. As a constituency MP, I've dealt with horrendous cases. This government is acting to get the truth and deliver justice. Number 10 has said that Lucy Powell has its backing, though there is speculation, they're not happy with her. I suppose they forced her to make that apology. Ash, what's your take on how Labour is reacting to its very poor election results?
Well, I mean, the first thing, which was the level of denial and it head in sand kind of affect from senior Labour figures, not just Wes Streeting, but Ellie Reeves also did the media around Rachel Reeves and some of her comments to the press, which is that, well, we've got to take really tough decisions. I don't think that anyone's going to be particularly happy with that, apart from Nigel Farage and Reform. He's going to be absolutely rubbing his hands with glee. Because if you go back to the winter fuel allowance, I mean, we said this at the time, Michael, which is, firstly, the saving that it's making the government. And for those listening on the podcast, I did some pretty heavy air quotations. The saving that the Treasury is making there is about 1.5 billion a year. So it's really not very much. And if you want to look at ways to raise revenue, you can also clamp down on tax avoidance. You can empower HMRC. That's something that you could do instead. It's not very much money, but the political consequences of it are absolutely dire. Firstly, pensioners are highly motivated voters. It's part of the reason why younger people get so screwed over, by government after government. It's because we tend to be lower turnout voters who are also concentrated in urban constituencies, whereas there is a big spread of pensioners and they're also highly motivated to turn out. The second thing is that there is a sense of fairness, right? The thing about a pensioner is that if they've worked their whole lives, they've paid into the system their whole lives. So I think that it's something which goes to the heart of what people think is wrong with this country, whether you are anti-immigration and pro-reform or whether you're like me and, you blame the parasitic landlord class, all the way up to BlackRock for making things worse. What unites both sides is this sense that people who actually work hard don't get anywhere. People who contribute to the system, who do forms of productive labor, who participate in socially useful activity, they don't get a payout. And so when you're attacking a pensioner, when you're scrapping something like winter fuel allowance, that goes right to the heart of that sense of unfairness. And it was a real tone deafness, an absolute tone deafness from Labour. And it was such an unforced error. I'm not surprised that Morgan McSweeney seems to be scrabbling around to repair his, sort of Svengali-like image of competence and intelligence, because it was so manifestly stupid. But the second point that I want to make is to talk about the grooming gangs. Now, I think that Lucy Powell's interjection, she says that she was motivated by, seeing a really serious issue reduced to a political talking point. But the manner in which she responded, it was also a bit of point scoring and pinball. But there is something which really bothers me about the way in which the grooming scandal is looked at. It's only ever looked at in terms of ethnicity and culture, and it's never looked at through the lens of what do grooming gang perpetrators from South Asian or Muslim backgrounds, what do they have in common with white perpetrators of group-based child sexual exploitation? Because when you say, well, the only way we can look at it is through the lens of culture and through race, you're saying that culture and race is an explanatory factor. And what that does is that rather than saying, well, actually, these sexual abusers, they've got something in common with the broader South Asian or Muslim community. And I actually think that means that obviously that tars everybody with the same brush in a way which is horrific. But two, and this is the most important point, I actually think that it puts victims of abuse or potential victims of abuse in even more danger, because you're not connecting the dots about what the risk factors and the indicators are for group-based child exploitation. One is, of course, impunity, a sense that I'm not going to get caught. That's obviously something that was felt by group-based sexual offenders in Rotherham and in Rochdale. The J report puts that down to the authorities feeling scared of being perceived as racist. I've always been a little bit skeptical of that explanation, but of course that can play a part. But that also plays a part when you've got white British offenders as well. That they're not scared of getting caught. They're not scared of being punished. Second thing, which I think bolsters that sense of impunity, is where you've got spaces where there aren't very many adult women around. Because when you've got a strong division between the genders, a strong division between the sexes, and you don't have adult women who are around and can, to put it very bluntly, monitor and call out the behavior of men. I mean, this is something that you saw within the Catholic Church. This is something that you've seen at elite boarding schools. And these are all factors which, again, mean that you've got abusers who feel like they're invincible and that they can target children. And then I think that there is something which is incredibly important here, which is the way in which authorities, and this goes from the police to, some people in social services. I don't think that this is all people in social services, but some who look at vulnerable children, especially vulnerable children who are care experienced, vulnerable children who come from working class backgrounds, and they view them as being consensual partners in what is child sexual exploitation. They say, oh, well, they're promiscuous. Oh, well, she thinks that he's her boyfriend. And because, unsurprisingly, children who are traumatized can also be disruptive, can also be difficult, they're treated like criminals. So they're treated, rather than being victims of, child sexual exploitation, these victims of abuse are instead treated like promiscuous criminals. And again, this is something which transcends race. This is how white working class victims have been looked at by the police. It's also something, and you see this in London, that working class children of colour are met with as well. And so this is my problem with looking at it solely through the lens of race, ethnicity, and religion, which is all these factors which are commonalities between group-based child sexual exploitation get missed. And I think what that risks doing is that it leaves victims unprotected rather than better protected.
The key thing is always, was there an element of it not being dealt with sooner because of racial sensitivity, right? And obviously that shouldn't happen. If there's a problem, you deal with it, right? Whatever the sort of fallout could be afterwards. But yeah, you've said you were never quite sure how much of a role that played anyway in this.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And the reason why is that when you look at the disparities when it comes to policing, being perceived as racist doesn't seem to stop police from conducting stop and search on very flimsy backgrounds. It doesn't seem to, stop police when it comes to, treating certain kinds of people more roughly, manhandling people more, the use of things like spit hoods, the use of force. So what you would have to be saying to me is that when it came to group-based child exploitation, that there was this unique carve-out where police were being scared of being perceived as racist in this way, but they don't really mind there being disparities in their policing activity in all these other ways. That's something which doesn't quite make sense to me. What makes more sense to me is that you've got a combination of factors. One is that you've got the way in which working class girls were being seen as promiscuous, being seen as troublemakers, basically being looked at as though, oh, well, she's a slag, right? So they were being adultified, right? That's something where children are being treated by other adults as if they are themselves adults. I find that perhaps more convincing because, again, it's a commonality that you see across the country, across ethnicities. And then the second thing is potentially police corruption. There are of course cases of police corruption. I believe there was one in one of the big grooming cases where police officers were found to have been illegally purchasing anabolic steroids from one of the perpetrators. It would make sense to me if there was a combination of those factors. Again, I'm not ruling it out. I'm not saying that there weren't individuals responsible for safeguarding, whether that's police or others who are scared of appearing racist. That may be true. But I kind of feel that these first two things may have been the overwhelming factors.